Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Beverly Kingston, and I direct the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence at the University of Colorado Boulder, so here. And our center has been around for 32 years. It was started in 1992 by Dr. Del Elliott, who's a renowned criminologist, and he was also my mentor during graduate school. And our center was founded to bridge the gap between research and practice to ensure that the very best things that we were learning about violence prevention could get in the hands of those who needed those most. But what I also say these days is that we also are trying to bridge the gap between practice and research. So we want to work both directions, and we learn so much from practice what we should be focusing on in our research. And I want to say just a couple things before we get started. We hear often in all these years from survivors of violence that what they wish for most is that their crimes could have been prevented. And you probably both hear that often as well. And the great news is that they can, that we do know so much from research about what works to prevent violence. And that's what we're here to focus on today. So for recording purposes, today is Friday, April 12th. It's 10:30 a.m., and this is panel number 18035, titled Violence is Never the Answer, Addressing the Rise of Physical and Virtual Violence. And before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. So here's how we're going to handle the questions and answers. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A, and we'll be using a note card system to receive questions from you all. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers. And try to write legibly. I get to read those cards. If you're a student, please note that in your question on your card. And when you finish writing your question, raise your hand to hand it to a producer who will then bring it up to me. And I urge you all to make your questions as brief and to the point as you can. And you can do this throughout the presentation, so you don't have to wait till any Q&A part. So at any time you get a question, just write it down. Okay, and now I'm so excited to do a brief introduction of each panelist. And I'm gonna do brief introductions, but you can read their extensive bios on the CWA website. Okay, so Heidi Bosch-Herod is the Executive Director of Women's Voices Now. Women's Voices Now is a nonprofit in Los Angeles that uses film to drive social change to advance girls' and women's rights globally. In 2021, she received a Daytime Emmy as a producer of the Girls' Voices Now series. She also teaches about anti-Semitism, other forms of hate, racism, and bigotry, and the power of film to make social change. So she gave me a fun fact, and I think this is fun. Actually, it is mostly really fun. She has 3 children under the age of 10. Yeah, I know it's fun and hard. And then Asia Eaton, our second panelist, is a feminist social psychologist and professor in psychology at Florida International University. Her research explores how gender intersects with identities such as race, sexual orientation, and class to affect people's access to and experience with power. Since 2016, she has served as the head of research for Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which aims to understand and end the epidemic of image-based sexual abuse in the US. She also has a fun fact, and she is a single mom of 2 boys that are ages 10 and 12. So both panelists had to leave their children to be here with us this week, which is pretty major and awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a question for both of them. And what I'd like to start with is, can you tell us about a little bit about you and your role in understanding and addressing violence? And we'll start with Heidi.
Thank you, Beverly. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to see so many of you here with us. So unlike Beverly and unlike Asia, I'm not in the research realm and academic realm. I'm more in the street realm, if you will. So for the past 12 years, I have watched maybe almost 1,000 films submitted by filmmakers from all over the world who are using their blood, sweat, and tears and talents to make documentary films about women's and girls' rights, abuses, struggles, and triumphs. And what I've seen over the past 12 years is there's a shift. And this year in our film festival that we're having right now, actually, the theme is the unintended consequences of our progress. So what that meant to me when coming up with that theme by watching the films from this year's selection is that, and I'm not a statistics person, I'll tell you that, but I try to memorize the big ones to talk about these things, but I'm not sharing those with you. But what I see is that there has been so much work done to address women's rights, the status of women. Laws have changed, access to education, political representation, economic opportunities, all of these things have changed. Women are in a much better place than they were decades ago. The work has paid off. Of course, there's so much more to do, and there is some backsliding right now. But the thing that never changes, and then of course increased during the pandemic, is violence against women. So it used to be 1 in 4 women globally will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Now in the United States, it's 1 in 3. The global one is still at 1 in 4. So it's frustrating and discouraging that while we believe we're making so many advances in all of the the things you can see, feel, and touch, when it comes to how a woman is the quality of this and the safety of her life, that we're not making much progress there. And I firmly believe that you cannot make change only from the top down. It has to come from the bottom up. And we're talking about violence for whatever reason, and I'm reading lots of books on this. In every society and every culture throughout the world, violence against women is a thing. And it is like the mysterious problem that we can't seem to really crack or solve. There are ways of doing this. So in my work, I believe very strongly, and it is not supported enough, that it's really about changing culture. And the way to change the culture of violence is to spark someone's empathetic reaction to someone else's suffering. And film is this incredible cultural influencer to try to get us to do that. So in communities where they are committing to changing cycles of violence, and they are literally absorbing content that shows the harms of violence and seeing themselves in that's when the shift starts to happen. But it's not happening at a broad enough scale.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Asia. I am an academic. However, I have made it my personal and professional mission to do public scholarship, which means that in my work, I center social issues, often women and girls, violence against women and girls. I try to disseminate my work broadly. I partner with community organizations to develop research questions and to design research studies. And I am committed to rethinking who has expertise in the area of violence against women and centering victim survivors. It has been my privilege since 2016 to work as head of research for Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is the nation's foremost nonprofit working to end image-based sexual abuse. This is when an individual's intimate or sexual images are shared without their consent or they're threatened to be shared. But I have done research on various forms of technology-facilitated sexual violence, most of which is perpetrated against women and girls. And we were talking just before the panel about solutions, which we do have. And if I was going to invest in one solution, right, sociocultural, technological, legal, corporate, it would be sociocultural through an educational lens. So I really am grateful for the work you're doing and want to thank you. But yeah, I'm excited for today's panel, and it's worth it being away from the kids to be able to engage with these folks on this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you both for your efforts in terms of, in our community we call it translational research, but where we're really trying to get this information out to the people that need it most. So I want to ask you another question, and I wanted to ask you about, what trends are you seeing related to violence, and what are you seeing, and what do you think is different today? Asia, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Many of you have probably read in the news headlines recently about this epidemic of deep fake abuse, sexualized deep fake abuse. Taylor Swift was a victim recently, AOC was a victim, and it's happening internationally. There was Cara Hunter, a Northern Irish politician, who was a victim, and then everyday women and girls mostly, including those in high school and even younger. And researchers and academics have been somewhat tuned into this issue for a while. I was actually saying that we wrote and submitted grants to the National Science Foundation back in 2016 about this, but it wasn't seen as a big enough problem to invest national resources in at the time. And so now we're here, where estimates are that something like 70 or 80% of women and girls moving forward are going to be victimized by sexualized deepfake abuse.
Will you define it?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. I assumed folks knew. It's just been in the headlines so much. So this is when someone's likeness, their face, is taken and superimposed onto a nude body or in a pornographic video, and it is so realistic. It looks like this person is actually nude. And there is software that can detect if this is real or fake. It doesn't matter. It's part of misogyny online. It's part of efforts to silence and intimidate women and girls. There's a number of reasons. There's also people who do this thinking it's fun and not understanding the devastating and lifelong consequences for the victim.
Yes.
But this has become a real problem, and it is a function of old things, right? Like gender roles,
Yes.
And also some new things like technological capability and the way that online algorithms are pushing individuals, especially men and boys, towards misogynistic content. And so we have, the statistic, the stability of this statistic is in part because of the how entrenched sociocultural norms around gender are, and it's also because of emerging developments in technology that are enabling abuse that we didn't used to have. So, yeah. That's something I'm seeing, sexualized deep fakes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So two sort of case studies come to mind when I think about this, which is, again, I mentioned how there's been so much progress legally to advance women, for example. But what I'm seeing, so let me backtrack. So about a year ago, I read a headline that was like, "Men believe women's rights have gone too far." Oh my. So I had to, of course, read this study and do kind of a deep dive, and it led me down a rabbit hole of, what could this actually mean? Do men really believe women's rights have gone too far? Do women believe women's rights have gone too far? Because I also contend that I believe women are a great obstacle to realizing their women's rights, and there's many reasons for that, good reasons. Fear of violence is one of them, if they actually exercise their rights. So when I did that deep dive, I actually understood that it really is actually almost 50-50, that there is this sentiment that because so much power has been restructured and redistributed over the past 4 or 5 decades, that it is causing a challenge to those who are used to having the world be in a certain way. But that doesn't mean that men don't want to see women advance, of course not, and that actually, when you go even deeper into the questioning of men's feelings towards this, it's more about, I actually don't know how to support promoting women's rights. There isn't a mechanism in my society. It's not culturally acceptable to show up as a women's rights advocate. So I don't even know how to insert myself in this battle. So I thought that was really interesting. But then when I see, so in that, it's not complacency, that's sort of like not knowing what to do, what ends up happening. So Morocco comes to mind. Not so many years ago, a law was put in place in Morocco to update the family law, forbidding the forced marriage of a girl to her rapist, right? Especially underage girls. So if a man rapes a woman, it used to be in Moroccan family law that she would be obligated to marry her rapist. Okay. There was a young woman who self-immolated. That started a whole countrywide protest, and so something actually came of that. But then what happened, because in Morocco there is not a separation, there's a very strong fusing of religion and state, there were loopholes being found, right? That this is against Islam, that we're going to go to our imam and he's going to say that you can't do this. And so slowly but surely the law is being whittled away in practice. And because it's such a big country and women are not all literate and they don't have access to this information and they don't have access to the NGOs helping to implement these laws, they are being forced into marriage with their rapists. And then when I think about here in the United States and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, I don't think I'm making this up. I'm pretty sure I read an article last year that you could put a bounty in Texas on people who were going to perform abortions. That is violent. I mean, that's the answer. So the law, you respond with violence. So I just see that the pushback against women's rights is a violent one, and it's finding loopholes even though we think we've got the plan, we have the way forward.
Yeah, thank you for both of those. And I will say I had not heard of the deep fake. And we work in violence prevention. Did I say that right? Deep fake nudes. And and I mean, and I just read the article in the New York Times that it's an epidemic, and this is something that we see over and over again, that we don't focus on prevention until things are an epidemic, and even then we don't often focus on prevention. Okay, so I've got some questions from our audience. This question came from a student, and it says, the decision not to prosecute violence or investigate cases has been linked to the lack of, I think this may be, it's rigor maybe, of the victim. So I think it's a lack of, I don't know, maybe the case of the victim, or whoever asked it could clarify if I'm not getting it right. But how can we combat this sentiment?
I'm not 100% sure I understand.
Right. Yeah, one more time? Yeah.
Okay, the decision not to prosecute violence or investigate cases has been, I think that what this is trying to say is, because I can't, this word is lack of righteousness? Righteousness? Yeah, I'm trying to guess, but what I'm getting a sense is that it's a question around kind of a blaming the victim. Yeah. So kind of, could you answer it from kind of that end where, or the victim maybe doesn't have a good enough case, or when there's decisions not to prosecute in some of these cases, can you talk about some of that from what you've seen?
Yeah.
And how can we address it?
Yeah. So this is a huge issue, victim blaming, especially as regards violence against women, and especially as regards sexual violence against women and girls. So I do a lot of expert witness work where I testify on behalf of victim survivors of image-based sexual abuse about the intense and long-lasting harms that this can cause individuals. They experience loss of employment. They have to leave the virtual world, which is where essentially everything is happening today. So they are forced out of society. They have PTSD from fear of their images recurring. They have family members see these images. Their children see these images. They have, existential dread about, has anyone in this audience seen my images? And then as the result of this, there's consequences like depression, anxiety, economic instability. I could go on, but it is not clear how bad this is to judges and juries. And so they have to bring me in to say, like, no, we've done the research with victim survivors. This is life-altering, and unlike other crimes, this continues to happen. The images keep being spread, and the violence keeps recurring. And the reason I bring this up is frequently I have heard judges or lawyers say things like, well, this is really their own fault. They should never have sent these images in the first place. And there's so much behind that. There's so much to unpack behind that. Yeah. But at the bare minimum, it is failure to appreciate, women's sexuality, and it is control over women's sexuality and sexual pleasure, because 77% of U.S. adults sexed, 77%, and it's not all young people. There's millennials are actually sexting at a greater rate than younger individuals. Now, this isn't the only way that these images are, acquired and disseminated through sexting, but, we need to embrace consensual, sexual, and romantic expression, especially among women, in all forms, free of shame, and we need to work towards women's sexual liberation and pleasure and empowerment. We have still a really puritanical view of sexuality in this country, and it's very controlling of women's decisions and choices, very shaming, and it goes back to our ideas about gender roles and what is appropriate and normative for men and women in the sexual sphere. And we have to address this in order to get to not blaming victims and looking at victims' conduct as the cause of someone perpetrating violence against them.
Yeah. So I want to respond to that question. I actually have another question, which might be for you, Beverly, which is, so with victim blaming, like, what is it about the unwillingness to do that work to prosecute? Like, what? Because ultimately we're human beings, and like you're saying, like a judge makes that decision. So that's someone's, lived personal experience coming into their deliberations on how to handle this. And it's almost like they suddenly don't know how to be clinical and legal about it. Like, it's their own projections, their own stuff. That's going to make, because a crime is committed, someone is suffering, we have laws to address the damages, right? But when it comes to, sexual-based violence, it just doesn't come through. Whereas this situation in Michigan, where the parents of the boy who did killed all those people with the mass shooting, that they're being held accountable for his murders, right? So that worked, that happened. I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but again, it's like, how do we respond to violence so that it doesn't happen again, to show like this was a crime, there are penalties, and it should discourage you from doing the thing again. So yeah, I think that's my question actually for Beverly.
I wish I had the answer. I don't necessarily, but it made me think about, you know, are there laws that need to be strengthened? Are there, you know, and we'll throw this all to both of you as well. You know, are there specific laws that need to be strengthened? Is it policies? Is it the different decision makers who are in those positions? You know, depending on maybe their belief system. You know, what are those factors that are the barriers? But recognizing that they're there, and then how can we make it? You know, I just think about victim survivors coming forward and how traumatic and how brave it is and how traumatic. I've watched many films, you know, documentaries about these kinds of situations, and it's a lot of times they go through something horrendous. They've already been through something horrendous. They're trying to stop it from happening ever again, and then they have to go through something horrendous there. So how do we help that? How do we get them, you know, the individual supports, systemic supports that are needed? So I think it brings up a critical point that we all need to be thinking about, and not just thinking, but looking at what actions could be taken there.
I mean, I can say there's, you know, the legal dimension to solving gender-based violence in and of itself has many components, right? You have like the legal, you have the educational, you have the sociocultural. There are many ways to address this. And just within legal, you need to strengthen existing laws. Often you need to create new laws. You have to enforce laws. You have to help law enforcement understand what the law enables them to do or doesn't. You have to help victim survivors facilitate their navigation of the legal system. Like, even just within that dimension, we have so much work to do. And I can tell you, as regards image-based sexual abuse, which is really the thing I know the most about, we do not have a federal law. It's currently left up to all the states. And all the states' laws are variable and patchy. And for some states, the victim has to have their name posted alongside their image in order to be able to prosecute. Other places, you have to be able to prove that the perpetrator did it with the intent to harm, which is a very high and unreasonable bar that we don't hold other crimes to. And so victims' ability to get recourse, even if they decide to enter this re-traumatizing legal system, varies depending on the state they're in. And you know, we have very few laws around deep fake sexualized abuse at all. And the reason we even have laws, let me make this very clear, is because 12 years ago or so, victim survivor Holly Jacobs found no ability. She had to change her name, by the way. That's how bad this is. That's not her birth name. She had no ability to seek recourse in the legal system. She sought out a law professor at University of Miami, and they created Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. At the time, there were 3 state laws. Now there's 47, and DC and 2 territories have a law. It is victim survivors who have led this whole thing, and are continuing to lead the push for a federal law. But, you know, we need help on multiple levels within the law.
And it's super helpful to kind of hear all the different levels and to start to learn about what do we need and what do we need to be thinking about in these different contexts. Okay, I've got many questions, and I'm gonna stick with this theme for a minute, then we'll switch over. Is it possible to determine who creates a deep fake video? And are the creators identified? Do we know who made the Taylor Swift deep fake, or do they simply get away with it?
In my experience, they are able to trace these back for the most part. I don't know how they do it. I mean, this is beyond my expertise. But I've been a part of many civil and criminal cases where the originator of the image was identified. Maybe if you do it in the dark web, not, but in a lot of cases they are able to be identified. often sometimes because they think they're in a private area posting things, and it's not really a private area, right? Like the Marines United Facebook case. I don't know if any of you heard of that. Back in 2017, there was a Facebook group that Marines were on sharing images of their women partners and of nude women in the Marines that they caught. And they were talking in this Facebook group amongst themselves, and felt private, felt anonymous. We're not anonymous. Other times people post on Reddit with their username and they feel anonymous, and they're not anonymous. So I don't even know the extent to which people attempt to disguise their identity when they're doing this. In some ways, you want to be, in certain spheres, you want to be known for having these images of this woman. That's a point of pride. That's a way to prove your masculinity to a deviant peer network. So they find them a lot of the time.
Okay, I'm going to ask this really broad question, and then I'll ask some narrow questions. But so this is a really broad one, and I'm not sure if we'll have answers or not. But how do you respond to the assessment that humans are inherently a violent species, and or how do you define basic human nature, and what does the research tell us? So it's a really big question. Just kind of get your take on it.
Ask it one more time. Those
Okay.
3 broad questions.
Three big questions, 3 very, very big questions.
Okay.
How do you respond to the assessment that humans are inherently a violent species? So, do you see that as human nature, or do you define basic human nature in a different way? And they're asking, what does the research tell us?
So I won't talk about the research, obviously. I'll give my opinion, I would say, based on being someone who studied several religions, actually. So there is definitely an inclination that we have to cause harm, and that is probably, well, not probably, it is, part of evolutionary biology, that we are wild animals on some level, but humans are distinct from animals because we have culture, and we're able to think these complex thoughts and language and all the things that come with that. And so I strongly believe, and the work I do would say I'm pretty committed to this idea, that we can overcome our evils or our lesser inclination, whatever it is. So I believe we're capable of it, but it takes a lot of hard work. And it's, again, disruptive of the natural order of things. And it's the easier thing to do, to just be violent and take care of your opponents in that sort of a way. It's much more difficult to reason and dialogue and work through difficult moments. But we're absolutely capable of doing this, obviously.
So I can see how, looking back at history, you might think that people are inherently violent. Especially when you hear a statistic like violence against women is 1 in 4. It's pretty stable. But I would argue, as a social psychologist, right, that our most fundamental basic need and instinct is to belong and actually to cooperate. That is the driving force behind much of our success. That we are unique from other species in our social dynamics, our ability to cooperate. We do compete too. I don't think violence is inevitable. I do not think violence is inevitable. I think cooperation is inevitable. I think grouping people so that there's an in-group and an out-group is potentially psychologically inevitable, but I don't think you have to assign negative characteristics to the out-group and see them as in competition with you. We do discern between people. We do differentiate between groups of people based on shared traits and characteristics, but that doesn't mean that the out-group is your enemy. We don't have to be doing that. If you look at our biology, we have, I don't know if you've heard of mirror neurons. When we see someone in pain, it activates our own pain system. We are empathetic creatures by design. And our ability to take care of and nurture each other is how we evolved as far as we are. So I firmly believe that I have hope. I have hope for us. And as you've already mentioned, the question is one of culture. Are we going to support, invest in, engage in a culture where opportunities are not perceived as zero-sum games? Are we going to invest in a culture where we cooperate, or are based on fear?
So it's not pushing back, but I just want to say, and I agree that our basic need is to belong and to cooperate, but that I think is between out groups. Like within the in group, there is clearly this need to establish a hierarchy. And so I think that's why that, and obviously we don't have the answer for why that happens, and I think that's why that intimate partner violence statistic doesn't change, because there's something actually within the in group that there needs to be, this is how things are done, this is how we order ourselves so that we can survive with the other out groups. So I'm just curious about that. Yeah.
Wow, this is getting good. Okay, so I'm a sociologist. That's what my training is, and I don't have necessarily the answers at all. I wish I did, but I do. The way we look at this is we look at, we look at patterns of behavior. We look at the underlying risk and protective factors, and we look at, we're looking at societies, and I truly believe we have choices around the society that we're going to create. So, some individuals could be, have some more risk at birth, for different kinds of qualities and characteristics. However, the social environment makes a huge difference. Huge. And so we can say, that there's, like I said, there's certain risk and protective factors. So for example, a young person, an elementary school age kiddo that is, exhibiting violent behaviors at that age, if there's not, interventions done, sometimes that kid will then continue on a pathway of violence. There's also, to get to the belonging and that connection, we know that young people that are around their teenage years, when they are not connected to pro-social society, when they don't feel like they belong, that's when those, what we call antisocial peers, start to really, they get connected. And then what happens in those situations is they learn about violence. There's many learned behaviors, and so if we can create different structures and processes where people can belong, I'm also thinking a lot about if there's a lot about are people's needs being met in our society, and that's throughout the life course. And when those needs aren't being met, those needs need to have power and agency over your life. If that's not met in a pro-social way, there can be antisocial outlets there as well. So, okay, this could be the whole day. Oh goodness, I got a lot here. So I'm going to go on to this one. Would you also address racist and LGBTQ and LGBTQ plus and religious violence? So different types. This is really asking us to look at. We've talked a lot about gender, some of the other forms of violence and how those are showing up.
I'll answer that briefly with a film that I watched recently called Kenya, which is a documentary about a transgender woman in Mexico City who is a street worker, a sex worker. And Kenya, the premise of the documentary is that Kenya's friend was brutally, in cold blood, murdered by a John in a car. And then the police did everything they could to cover up that had just happened. So the documentary is really about Kenya's sort of awakening to this. Like, obviously Kenya, she knows that because she's a trans woman, violence and sadly, like, sex work and drug addiction, this is going to be part of her story, and it is actually the part of her entire community's story. But she wants to fight, she can't stop the Johns from shooting her friends and her community, but she can work on how her fellow trans trans sex workers respond to the violence and how they present in the world. And so it's all about, first of all, showing the types of violence, showing the struggles that trans women are facing in places like Mexico, but I think that mirrors throughout the world. And then really the process of, I would have to say, like, not succumbing to the hatred. It was really interesting, like sort of knowing that you live in a world that is stacked against you and is going to take a really long time, if ever, to accept you. But you don't want to live a life of misery, and you have to work with what you have. And so bringing together other trans women to be a support system, to work on the drug addiction issues, to not practice the violence that's been practiced upon them, so not repeating those violent patterns. And then I also just thought it was so fascinating that the documentary is primarily trans women, but all of the people who are showing up to support this group of trans women sex workers who all come together in this collective are other women. And I just thought that was a really fascinating thing, that these are people who no one wants to see or accept, and they are, subjected to the worst kind of sexual and all forms of violence. And yet they're trying to rebuild, like, in a positive way, and to not repeat the patterns. So that's how I would respond to that question. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a huge question. I will just briefly reflect on the fact that all of these forms of social oppression are interconnected. So, for example, I've done some research on discrimination against gay men at work. And a lot of the rationale behind that had to do with the fact that gay men are perceived to be feminine, and being feminine is perceived to be a negative, a lesser than, a lower than trait. So it's really relates to gender roles, right? You're also seen as gender atypical if you're a queer person. So these things are highly interrelated. And then you have the ways they intersect, which are fascinating. So violence against Black women is different in terms of rates and nature than violence against Asian women. All of these things have to be considered in tandem, in an intersectional way, to understand how to protect and protect people from violence and its consequences, and prevent violence and its consequences. All of these things are critically important.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how
You got to write it down.
Can you tell us how Asian and Black women are differently treated?
Should we wait for her to write it down?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, we're only taking the questions by the cards. I know that's a little hard, but thank you for writing them down. I also wanted to add, one of the things when we look at bullying around among young people, it's really anything that they're perceived as different. So it could be, the LGBTQ+, it could be size, it could be religion, whatever makes them different than their peers leads to higher rates of bullying. And that can be really, really high. And it's really important for, if we're talking about schools, communities, to be aware of that, because they may have low rates of bullying overall, but specific populations can be targeted and really suffer from horrendous consequences. And as was shared in this panel, you got to write it down. Oh, you're for the card. Thank you. Sorry, you got it. And anyway, we need to watch, really make sure that we're designing interventions for those different populations.
Yeah, and the aspect of religion-based violence. So I've done some work on a documentary and research, actually, in grad school on honor-based violence. So honor-based violence, are we familiar? Should I give a brief definition?
Yeah.
Honor-based violence is prevalent in societies, mostly Muslim societies, but it didn't originate in Islam, where a woman's body and what she does or doesn't do with it determines the honor of the family. So if a woman marries someone without permission, it wasn't arranged, or if a woman has a boyfriend, if a woman is perceived to have behaved in a way to violate the honor code of the community, she will be killed, usually by a brother, a father, a cousin. There will be a they'll call it a suicide, but it's a forced suicide. And there's so much work being done in these communities to address, so Turkey, Morocco, Israel, those are some of the 3 countries that come to mind where a lot of work against honor-based violence has really taken a lot, has come a long way. But it's never just about the laws. It's never just about the laws. It's about getting the community to sign on, right? Getting the religious leaders to say, no, this is actually wrong. This is a violation of our religion. We have, the honor is not upon the woman. It's about the whole family's behavior. The concept of revenge in some of these communities. So just like tackling, age-old cultural practices and saying, culture does change. It's not against your religion culture is always changing, right? It's always, always, always evolving. So just because it was done this way doesn't mean it can't be done in a different way, but it takes so much work and buy-in because you're challenging the power structure and the order of a community. And as soon as that is felt, then it's a threat to the stability of a community, especially when we're talking about tribal communities, clan-based societies. It causes a very traumatic response. So it's very frustrating, very slow moving work, but it is happening and it has to be done.
Yeah, that's really hopeful. Okay, so this question is talking about the fictional dystopian novel and TV series, The Handmaid's Tale, which depicts a stark, violent future for women in the United States. How far do you think we are from that becoming a reality?
I think we live that reality. I think there's so much violence that isn't reported. I think, I hate to say it, but when I'm in spaces of all women and if we're watching a film or having a certain discussion and slowly, almost every woman in the room will share something she's experienced in her life, I think we're absolutely living it. There's just still so much shame, and it's so normalized we don't even realize unless we're talking about it. Oh, I did, someone did touch me inappropriately, or what did happen there, or like I was on a date and it didn't go the way I wanted it to, or, it's horrifying, and it's a real. So until people really grapple and come face to face with the prevalence of this violence, I think we're living it. I don't think, I think that series and the film, the book are just a reflection of our reality. Sadly, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
It's true.
Okay, so where is the evidence that films impact change in our culture?
Yeah. So first, I'll say that I don't have all the statistics memorized, obviously, but the Ford Foundation funded a huge project that was multinational, several countries. They chose a selection of films, long, feature, and short. It was Kenya, India, Guatemala. Those are the 3 countries that I remember. And they showed this series of films that were relevant to the communities in those places. And they traveled with it. And then they stayed in touch with the communities. So it was a community member who showed the film. They had questions for dialogue afterwards. And then they stayed with them for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and showed how rates of certain types of violence started to go down. That project only stopped because the funding ran out. When I connected with someone at ITVS they were carrying out this study, that was I'm like, this is working. What do you mean? Like for women's voices now, this is the best thing ever. And I'm like, well, the funding ran out. Okay, so it absolutely happens. I'll give you a concrete example though from my own work. So back in 2014, we had a film called Handful of Ashes from Iraqi Kurdistan, where a group of aid workers that were working in the Kurdish areas of Iraq during and after the war in Iraq to go help like the Kurdish villages basically to rehabilitate and address their humanitarian needs. Again and again, women were coming up to them and telling about the complications from female genital mutilation. And so this group of Iraqi Kurdish humanitarian workers decided to make a short film showing the harm of female genital mutilation, how it was affecting marriages, how it was affecting women, how it was affecting children, and then also got an imam, very important, to come in and say this is actually not part of our religion, this is a cultural practice, we can change this, we don't have to continue this. They took this film and they screened it in several villages, with a generator and on a blank wall somewhere, and again, had important, serious closed door conversations with the community, moving them through this process of yes, we can decide as a community to change this practice. Plus, they said, we will also build a well in your village so the water is accessible. So a little incentive that benefited everyone, plus an honest conversation about the harms this was doing. Sometimes it was the first time men heard from their women how badly it was affecting them. And then the men were able to say, yeah, and our sex life sucks. Like, they didn't use those words, but that was what they were saying in so many words. And then many of those villages they're very proud that they are 0 cases of FGM anymore in Iraqi Kurdistan. So that is a very specific case from this one film, plus the incentive of the will. But you had to have that conversation to change the culture and to get everyone on board to do it. So it is very effective. I could give you other examples. I will not. You'll have to check out our website and watch films. Yeah.
I'll just add that there's a lot of experimental research showing that cultural products, images like film, are incredibly powerful for affecting attitude change and behavior, and even in minute doses, right? Like, we have research showing that exposure to Instagram photos that have been photoshopped versus not photoshopped affect girls' self-esteem differently. That playing with Barbie versus Mrs. Potato Head affects career aspirations. Wow. It's true. It's in a negative way. And this is like in the laboratory in tiny doses. So certainly, long-term, in-depth exposure and critical analysis of these kind of products is going to produce change.
Yes.
Yeah, here at CU Boulder, there's a project called Shakespeare and Violence Prevention that we've been doing since 2011. In case you're interested in looking at it, where the Colorado Shakespeare Festival takes their productions into classrooms all throughout Colorado, and they've reached about 120,000 young people throughout the years. And what they do is they use theater to help foster empathy, to talk about things that are really difficult to talk about, and it's really been positively received. And that's an area, I think, bringing in the arts into our efforts around prevention and getting these messages out is such a great way to foster conversation, to also, what they do in the Shakespeare work is they do a lot of role playing with the young people, and so you need to be not only like see it, but you also need to practice and understand. They focus a lot on how can you be an upstander, how can you make a difference, and those are some of the themes that I'm hearing from both of you. Okay, so this is another question. It kind of builds on almost what you some of the examples you just shared. What countries and or cultures have very little violence against women?
None, absolutely none. I mean, even, we always celebrate the Scandinavian countries. They're led by women, run by women. The quality of life is great. Everyone has a strong safety social net. That statistic holds true for them also. Did we not read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo or whatever? That was very much based on sexual violence in what was it, Finland? I can't remember anymore. But none. We're all guilty. Yeah.
I mean, there are definitely places that do a better job of supporting, treating victim survivors, right? Yes. So, I'll just say I spoke with the Ministry of Women and Family in South Korea. They did a whole conference on image-based sexual abuse. Wow. They have put a ton of resources into this problem. They have a national hotline that victim survivors can call that will actually help them take the images down. Like, in Australia, they have really excellent laws against sexualized deep fake abuse. The UK is doing better than us. It's like, there are places that have good laws and do more to support victim survivors. But the cultural misogyny remains a global problem.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Because there's not a culture that's wanting to move those laws forward in certain places. Yeah. Exactly. But I love that there are some models, in places that are doing better, or you are seeing change in certain places. So a couple questions are, about when we're working with young people. If my teenager girl is deep faked, what should I do?
So I would say first line of defense is to visit the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative website. And there you can see what the deepfake law is in your state, if there is one, and mostly there's not. There is a hotline. They don't help you take the images down, but there's a hotline and they can hook you up with services. There are pro bono lawyers who will will support you. There are takedown services. So a lot of these you have to pay for that will locate the image and take it down for you when it pops up. But there's no way to remove that image permanently that I've seen. It's always gonna reappear. People, screenshot and save it to a folder, upload it again. One of the victim survivors I know, Emma Holton, was victimized by image-based sexual abuse in her teens. Today she is still fighting it, and she's in her 30s. She's become a real advocate, but it still pops up for her. So it's going to be about coping, unfortunately, and making a lot of victim survivors have benefited from becoming activists and advocates.
Yeah.
There's also online support communities that can be helpful. But actually, some folks I've talked to have said that it was empowering to sort of spin the narrative around and say, yes, I was deepfaked, here I am. Now, that depends on your level of privilege and power, okay? You can't always martyr yourself in that way, but a lot of them said, I was put in the public eye, I have no choice now. So I might as well get behind this cause and try to protect other potential victim survivors. But yeah, it's going to be a secondary, tertiary prevention coping situation once you have an image disseminated. Yeah,
and we also work some with the Cyberbullying Research Center. Are you familiar with that work?
Yes.
A little? Yeah, they're a great resource as well, and try to stay on top of all these issues, especially working with schools. So that's another place to look, for different supports. So this is a question that we've encountered quite a bit in our center. As parents of young children, can you comment on violence in video games?
Yeah, I think the evidence is generally that exposure to violence, whether it's video games or violent pornography, tends to beget violence. I think not for everyone, but there is going to be a mean level increase after exposure to that kind of stuff. It normalizes it. It also gives you creative ideas for how to perpetrate that you might not otherwise have thought of. It can be tied to increasing your status in peer groups. So I'm not one to say avoid all social media, avoid all screens. That's a great overgeneralization, but I limit my children's exposure to violent material. I can't always do it. There will come a point when I will not be able to do that anymore. But for the time being, yeah.
Yeah, I would, not from a research standpoint, but I just would agree anything that we're exposed to repeatedly is going to influence our behavior. Anything we experience repeatedly, we're more likely to repeat, good and bad.
Well, from what I'll kind of answer it from research. So as I talked about, there are different risk factors for violence. And when we've looked at separating out that exposure to media, or to video games, it's not, and I haven't looked at the latest research in it, but in the past, it's shown that it itself, it doesn't have a strong impact. However, if you're someone that has multiple risk factors for violence, if you're someone that is disengaged from what I was talking about, pro-social life, you're really looking to belong somewhere, it is something that, again, it's teaching you violence and it's exposing you to those contexts. So I think it's something that some people are going to be more impacted by than others. And as we've shared, even thinking about how much money is spent on advertising in our society, like that the fact that that's happening and how much we know that people are researching that and there's huge investment. So putting things out there in the culture, you know, even though we've not teased out how it affects every single different area, matters. And so I think what we're putting out there really does matter. Yeah. Okay, so there's also a question on this idea that online abuse does not have borders. It's a global phenomena. How can this be addressed at a multinational level?
Oh, that's such a great question, and we are not doing a good job right now. Even within the U.S., if 10 minutes? Okay. Even in the U.S., it is unclear where the jurisdiction is for technology-facilitated sexual abuse. Is it in the state where it was perpetrated? Is it in the state where the victim survivor was at the time, or where they reside? It's actually kind of a mess, and it's like getting decided on a case-by-case basis right now. And then you have the issue that you can perpetrate a crime against someone in a whole other nation, and then there's different laws around that kind of crime. So we definitely need to do more to collaborate. I just got back from a visit to Belgium, which was a function of a collaboration between the EU and the US to increase researchers' access to social media platform data. And the idea is we're going to start to collaborate around looking at risk factors and preventative factors for online violence using the data that these platforms collect and looking at it multinationally. But like, we're just starting. So that is the issue for us to shine a light on and look forward to.
To your knowledge, Asia, what sort of international body, if that caught on and it was more than EU and US?
The Trade and Technology Commission of the EU and US. Yeah, they just made some new laws around data access in the EU, and they've partnered with us. Look, I'm not a politician. I don't understand the ins and outs, but
And
yeah.
in terms of, you know, this, I'm going to just add a comment to this. You know, a lot of times, perpetrators, especially of what we call targeted violence, so that's the mass violence, the mass shootings, they communicate about what they're going to do. There are warning signs that other people see. So oftentimes they're posted online, they're communicated. And so there's also, you know, we can also be stewards of seeing what is online, and we can, you know, report concerning behavior. And what we're trying to do a lot with our center is trying to build systems around the support. So ideally, people don't, you know, escalate on to targeted violence, that they don't, it doesn't go on to be these horrific crimes. When we're trying to see some of these online posts as cries for help and trying to get people the supports that they need. And so advocating for that is something that we can also take action. So I think as you shared, both of you shared, we need solutions at all these different societal levels. There's individual, the community level, the national level, in all these different sectors needing to get involved. But we've got to have, I think, that really understanding of what's going on in order to effectively intervene. And then we also need to really understand what the research says as well in terms of what are the predictors of violence. So I'm going to switch gears again. Okay, so this is an interesting one. I'm guessing men may not flock to see documentaries regarding the subjects that are addressed. How are perpetrators educated, changed, reached?
I am so glad that this question was asked, because I was thinking we're almost out of time, and if we get like a last statement, I want to talk about this. So that's amazing. So
Right on.
it may feel very uncomfortable, but the majority of perpetrators of violence are men. It's just a fact. Let's just breathe on it and not get upset by it. It's just a fact. You have to deal with problems face on by acknowledging the issue. Back in December, I worked with a filmmaker to do a screening of her documentary called Behind the Rage, Why Men Abuse Women in the United States. And like you said, Asia, that the biggest proponents fighting against deep fake sexualized violence are the victims, the survivors. And it is mostly women doing this work of addressing violence against women. But if we're the victims or the survivors, the perpetrators are the ones who are going to be able to give us insight as to why this is happening. If we're not going to continue victim blaming, then the people who carry out the violence need to step forward and shed some light on why this is happening. So Behind the Rage, this very painful, difficult 99-minute documentary interviews several men who either abused their partners and their partners still stay with them. One man murdered his wife, spent 25 years in jail, was released from jail, and he's spending his life working with other men who are abusive and who are trying to break their cycle and trying just to get into the underlying root cause of why men abuse women. And inevitably, the stories of these men, of course, share that they were abused, and this is how they know to show love. They have a fear, 5 minutes? Thank you, Maddie. They have a fear of being abandoned. So, and then you put that on top of a culture in this country, all countries, where men, there's this idea of like masculinity. We all have a feminine and masculine within us. So it's not just about men having this, but we have that force to keep us stable and straightforward, which is our like turning off our emotions, not feeling vulnerable, just getting through the difficult situation. And in the masculine energy, that's a little more pronounced. And so to break down your trauma, what you've gone through in life, and to understand how that trauma actually did collect in your being, and now you're carrying out that same abuse that hurt you, but you're going to hurt others because that's how you know how to show love, and you're afraid of being abandoned because the people who were supposed to love you and cared for you, they stayed in the game with you, but it was violent. So it's a very powerful documentary to watch. So I firmly believe that it would be so amazing to see more men and young men step into this place with women, because as a women's rights activist of an organization founded by a man, it's the balance that we need. All boats need to rise here. It's not about women leaving men behind or vice versa. We need to come together to tackle these really challenging things that we face, violence against women being one of the most prevalent issues of the world, so that we can have a better world and just have more fun. Like, can we just have more fun and good times and talking about this? So I think, and it takes all of us to do this. It's not just women, it's not just men. We have to have a conversation like this about this, and then figure out, okay, how do we face our demons and turn them into angels,
Yes.
Beautiful, thank you.
Did you want to comment in there?
I'll just say, yesterday I was on a different panel where there was a question about, how can men be allies, and I didn't take the opportunity to address it, but it's really good news, because all you have to do is believe women and start anywhere. Start anywhere. Start anywhere. Start in your house. Start at your school. Start at work. Right? You don't have to watch the films. You can do something else. Because it's everywhere. You get to start anywhere, and any little inroads matters. Right? We've been talking a little bit about like the inevitability of violence, and is there anywhere that has solutions? And sometimes I vacillate between feeling hopeless and then seeing all the good work that's being done. And in order to continue on this path, I try to look towards the good work that's being done. And there's Jackson Katz, there's men who are doing this work, and they are essential to ending violence against women. I actually belong to this group on Facebook that's called something like Men Can Stop Rape. Like, guess what? You can do it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's a lot of hope.
Yeah. Oh, I'm really glad. We have 2 minutes left, so I have this. This is a tough question, but I think really important. Can you discuss the fear women have to stand up to domestic violence, and how much protection and rights the abuser has? So it's a tough one, but I think it's important to just say a few words about what women can do if they find themselves in a difficult situation like this.
As someone who has tried to be supportive of friends and colleagues in those situations, the worst thing to do is to tell someone to get out of a bad situation.
Yeah.
And women have to believe themselves. They have to believe that they're deserving of a better life, of a better reality. They have to be willing to have the rug pulled out from under them, because quite often when you leave an abusive situation, it means you don't have a home, maybe you have to leave your job because you have to leave the place, maybe you have children and you have to figure out how to support and provide for them, and there are not enough resources for the amount of women who are going through this. So you have to go on your journey, you have to let your world fall apart around you and just believe that you're going to be able to rebuild it.
Yeah. So, yeah, I know we're not giving that question enough time that it deserves, but thank you for asking it, and there are supports as well. Just to end, we have our last minute. Do you have any closing seconds? You would have anything? Yeah, Asia, go ahead.
Oh, for anyone who has been victimized by violence, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Agree.
And yeah, I want to say there is so much hope that we can heal these cycles of violence. There's lots of resources, there's lots of supports. It has happened. We can keep going forward. And what I always say is that we can keep planting these seeds. And this team, these are seed planters. I think they're growing giant trees. So thank you so much, panelists, for your incredible work. It's been an honor to moderate this panel.